climate change has been weaponized into this end of world kind of argument. And the media loves it for obvious reasons because it sells, gets you more clicks, that kind of thing. But also most politicians love it because they get to say, the world is ending, but vote for me and I'll make sure it goes away.
We're always talking about what's going wrong in the world and why things are really bad and the world's coming to the end. So we thought today we'd focus on reasons to be slightly more cheerful. Are there reasons to be positive about what's going on in the world right now? And who better to ask than the Danish political scientist, Bjørn Lomborg. Bjørn, welcome to Times Radio.
Matt, it's great to be here.
So we spend a lot of time, I suppose because we are in the news business, talking about at home, it's public services falling apart, all the cost of living crisis, and then you've got wars breaking out around the world, and then the climate crisis, which is engulfing the entire planet. So we wanted to sort of talk to you today about, are we right to see a catastrophe in everything? Are there reasons to be cheerful?
Yes. So it's important to say, when you listen to the news, we talk about problems. Now, that's fine because those are the ones we want to fix. But it's not a good way to get informed about how the world is overall doing. Look, you guys, news is a very curated sample of all the things that have gone wrong in the last 24 hours. It's not surprising that you get a very wrong sense of how the world is doing. Just to give you one example, for the last 25 years, every day, not just every second day, but every day, each of the newspapers around the world could have had as a cover story, 138,000 people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 24 hours. For the last 25 years. Now, if you ask most people, they actually think that more people live in poverty now than they used to. Of course, that's nowhere true. We've seen a dramatic decline. And this is one of the reasons why you don't get a good sense of proportion. And so I'm just going to give you sort of the very brief primer of why things are overall much, much better. Look,
it's what we're here for. It's what we're here for.
Yes, we live much longer. In 1900, the average life expectancy for a person on the planet Earth was 32 years of age. Last year, 2023, it was 73. We've more than doubled our lifetime. You and I and everybody else now lives more than 2 lifetimes on this planet. That's fantastic news. We have much less poverty, as we just talked about. We're much better educated. We have much more food. We have actually, in very many ways, dealt with a lot of the environmental problems that we thought we had. For instance, indoor air pollution dramatically reduced. And that is incredibly important because that has been the vast majority of pollution cases, which is the vast majority of environmental problems, because we've lifted people out of poverty. And of course, just incomes have risen more than 10 times. So we are much better off. Now, there are lots of problems. Absolutely, the world could be much better than what it is today. But we're on a trajectory that is going to leave us by the end of the century much, much better off on most things. And so when we talk about all these other problems, for instance, climate change means the world will be slightly less much better by the end of the century. That's a problem, but it doesn't mean it won't be much, much better. Now, there are some things that we should be concerned about, like, for instance, nuclear war. If we don't contain that could dramatically change the picture. There are some people who'd argue AI could potentially do that. This is not my field of specialty, but if you look at what the UN is actually predicting for 2100, we're going to live longer, we're going to have higher incomes, we're going to be better educated, we'll have virtually nobody in hunger, we'll have virtually nobody in extreme poverty, $1 a day kind of thing. Mostly, this will be a much better world, but still with challenges, and that's the ones that we need the daily news to tell us what should we do about.
Is part of the problem that we've been, again, this is broad brush, but we've been on a sort of apparently unstoppable conveyor belt of things getting better, whether that is life expectancy or incomes or whatever it might be. And actually, there's this sort of slight feeling that, in some countries in the UK, life expectancy is either halting or going backwards. There are, some groups, and depending on how you measure it, people going into poverty who hadn't been before. The cost of living crisis, real wages haven't grown in the last decade or so because of, the financial crash and COVID and all of that. And so there's just this feeling that what used to be a sort of smooth, reasonably smooth path to progress. Is it like, well, we're going, it's 2 steps forwards, 1 step back, and it's unsettling, and there's this sense of maybe even unfairness that the people enjoyed all the booming, the good times. That this is a current
I
sort
think
of
there's
cohort.
two relevant comments to that. One is, if you go back in time, we had just the same sorts of complaints. So it's not like this is new. If you go back 50 or 100 years, people were also like, oh my God, the world is coming to an end. And it did, right? So it's important to sort of keep that in focus. But I think something else is also happening, that our expectations of how much better things are going to be are running ahead of what they're actually doing. And so people are sort of, I thought I was going to be much richer, but I'm only a little richer. I thought I was going to be much better off, and I'm only a little better off. This sort of thing. If you look at the science fiction episodes in the 1950s, you saw sort of flying cars, and you had these little things gizmos that you could communicate with people on. We only got one of those two, and it feels like we should have had both, right? And I get that sort of disappointment, but you also need to sometimes step back and say, yes, but things are actually dramatically better. Now, it is incredibly important then to have the conversation. How do we make sure that our kids and our grandkids are much better off? And how do we make sure we do that in a sustainable fashion? All these other things that we're realistically concerned about, but we don't often have that discussion. How do we actually make sure we get better off? We're so focused on all the things going wrong that we forget that a lot of the things that we will fix by 2050 is because we'll be better off and more resilient.
To what extent is there also a bit of our hyperconnectivity now means that, in the quotes good old days, when your only connection with what was going on beyond your street or your town was you might read a paper in the morning and you might watch the TV news at tea time. Whereas now you can spend all, whether you call it doom scrolling or whatever you call it, but you can spend all day finding things to be very concerned about. Normal citizens who didn't actually spend much time thinking about politics, definitely weren't, getting live pictures around the clock of that humanitarian catastrophe there or that, climate warning there. Did we live in a state of blissful ignorance before?
Possibly. It's hard. These are very, very hard questions to answer. And honestly, I mean, I'm old enough to pretty much remember what that was like. And I think I was still very worried. I used to be a member of Greenpeace and be very worried about a lot of things. I do think, though, that it's important to say, while you can see a lot of doom scrolling on Twitter or wherever you do this, it is much more the official ways that we're packaging things. So you mentioned climate change before. Climate change has been weaponized into this end of world kind of argument. And the media loves it for obvious reasons, because it sells, it gets you more clicks, that kind of thing. But also most politicians love it because they get to say, the world is ending, but vote for me and I'll make sure it goes away. And of course, a lot of NGOs do this. So I think this is also useful ways of manipulating people by simply scaring the socks off them. And we're doing that very, very well, for instance, with climate. Now, again, climate is a real problem. But we need to get a sense of proportion, and we often don't have that. If you look, for instance, what do we expect is going to happen with our food supply? Well, if you look at the best estimates, and there are lots of these, I'm just going to give you one of them, but one very well-respected period, multiple models, that kind of thing, shows if there was a lot of climate action, we would see by 2050 an increase in agricultural production totally for the world of 54%. But if we don't manage to do this, and we sort of don't do very much about climate, it will be 53%. Now, most newspapers will tell you there will be less food in 2050 because of climate change, which is technically true, but it's also dramatically misleading that the main point, of course, is that we will be much better fed in 2050. But because of climate change, it may take another 9 months. So instead of in January 2050, we'll have 54%. It'll take to September 2050, which is a problem, but it's not the end of the world.
Is there a bit of, though, that's like a global picture, that overall, yes, that is, 54% for the entire globe. But in reality, what that means is there'll be parts of Africa where you can't grow anything anymore. But Cornwall is going to have a really good wine harvest, and so the experience of individuals could be very negative, even if globally the line on the chart is improving.
There's a little bit of that, but there's a lot of news person than you who also would like the. It's not that Africans are going to be totally unable to produce their food, but they will clearly have more problems. One of the ways, of course, to make sure that they have fewer problems is by making sure that most people don't work in agriculture, but they actually work in cities, just like everywhere else, and that you produce food where it's most economical and where it grows the best. But again, we need to remember the size of this problem. We're talking about a slightly higher challenge, but not that you won't be able to produce any food. I don't know about you, but I've never really produced any food in my life, and that's certainly true for most people. Except for that you plucked a few apples or something. But
put some carrots in the garter, but it's not. It's got a small proportion of my eating,
and it's certainly not something that's going to keep you alive, right? The point is that we have a system that works incredibly well. And yes, there will be changes to that system because of global warming. And there will be some places where you'll be able to grow better. For instance, one of the things that will happen is not that you will grow nothing in Africa, but that you will grow different things. And so often things that will need either more rain for places where there'll be more rain, or be more drought resistant or salinity resistant, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of challenges that we'll have to overcome. Absolutely. It's not like this is going to be a no problems journey. But then again, if you think back in the 1960s, it wasn't like they managed to make our world produce much, much more food, much better quality, and one that's pretty much globally integrated without a lot of challenges. They did that exactly the same way. There will be a lot of fights and struggle on that path. But the fundamental point is, this is not going to be the end of the world. Just like most other things that we're talking about is not going to be the end of the world. We'll actually be better off, but for some of these problems, slightly less better off.
I suppose the all this does depend, like you said, on some action being taken, and then there's a question of whether or not that action is being taken fast enough by the right people. People always make this point: what's the point of me recycling my milk bottles if in the time it's taken for it to be recycled, China's built 4 power stations, whatever it might be. And so as a result, you get the bodies who are concerned about this ramping up their rhetoric to try and get action. So you get the World Health Organization saying, they say climate change presents a fundamental threat to human health. It affects the physical environment as well as all aspects of natural and human systems. It goes on to say it is therefore a threat multiplier, undermining and potentially reversing decades of health progress. I suppose the question is you're saying that we do need to adapt and we do need to make changes. Do you think that we are making the changes we need to make so that we don't have the catastrophe that you don't think we're heading for?
So we're certainly not investing enough, for instance, in research and development into yield enhancement. So this used to be a big thing, that you would invest a lot in making sure that food and vegetables were grown better with higher yielding varieties, so that more people could get fewer people could get more food out of the same amount of land. And this is especially true in the poor part of the world, where, remember, the big Monsantos of the world don't really have an interest because there's not much to sell. But we should take this seriously. Obviously, the poor world government should do that as well, but they have many other demands on their money. This is one of the places where we should be spending more of our development aid, and we're not. So there are definitely places we should do this. One of the things we should also be careful about is not to do too much. So, if you look at sort of the argument of a lot of people saying we should go to 2 degrees centigrade, that's an upper limit of how much we want to do. If you actually run the models, you remember the 54 and the 53%. What these models show is if you actually try to reach 2 degree target, you need to tax a lot of fossil fuel emitting substances. One of those things is going to be fertilizer, because this is mostly made with natural gas around the world, and we're hugely dependent on this. What that would mean is if you get the taxes right, people will use less fertilizer. That's nice because it emits less CO2, but it's unnice because it actually produces less food. What they end up showing you is that then the world will end up producing 48% more food by 2050. And the point here is, first of all of these numbers are great. We're going to have much, much more food, but we'll actually be slightly worse off even if we try to solve the problem by just trying to solve it with sort of regular climate policies. Now, this doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything about climate, but it means we need to be very careful that we don't apply such strong measures that we end up making most people worse off. Again, the way to fix this is to a very large extent make sure that we get better yields so that few people can produce more food, but also that we invest a lot more in coming out with this green energy that will eventually be the cheap energy that will take over the world.
But is the alternative view that actually we just need to be honest that given that what the humans are doing to the planet, in order to make sure we don't destroy the planet, we are going to have to accept trade-offs and downsides, and having 48% more food rather than 54% more food. I mean, that's a sort of in a parallel universe which doesn't exist anyway, and it's very hard for people to quantify that. That there are downsides, and actually politicians and other climate campaigners, whatever, aren't being honest. They don't say we do need to do this because we need to address the climate challenge, but there will be downsides to that, and actually pretending that you can have everything.
I think you're definitely right that we should be more honest about it. But I would actually argue, and that's what the climate economists will show you. The only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize, William Nordhaus, tells you we are trying way too hard. We're actually trying to do something that ends up doing less good than what we want to do. And so we also got to be honest that sometimes you can do too much. And one of the things that will happen is that in your very well-meaning attempt to try to make more food for people, you actually ended up making less food because you made fertilizer too expensive. That shows you, and I think we see this in a lot of different circumstances, that because people are so concerned about this one thing, namely that we're going to destroy the planet with climate change, and that's not really what's in the card. We're going to make the world slightly much better off with climate change. What we need to get is, how do we fix this in a way that doesn't cost more than the problem that we're trying to solve? And that is make green energy so cheap that everyone will want to buy it. Just one example, if you could get fourth generation nuclear power, the one that comes small modular reactors, incredibly safe, incredibly cheap, to work, then everyone would buy them, not just rich, well-meaning Brits, but also China, India, and Africa, which are the main emitters of CO2. The point here is we are making this conversation in a very small fraction of the human population. So, like 16% of all the rich countries that are trying to be virtuous, but actually, we're still about 80% fossil fuel, even in the rich world. But we're trying and we're doing something. But we're doing things that are just not replicable in Africa. It's not like Africans look at Germany and look at their energy policies and say, yes, we want that. Deindustrialization and incredibly high energy prices. That is something you can possibly do if you're very rich. But even there, they're struggling, right? But you're certainly never going to do this for poor populations that mostly just want to lift their people out of poverty.
And actually, on that subject, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says in vulnerable regions, the death rate from extreme weather events in the last decade was 15 times higher than in less vulnerable ones. But then I noticed you posted on Twitter saying, despite the climate narrative, almost everywhere cold is much more deadly than heat. Are you suggesting that actually the gain from the planet warming up means that overall the gains from fewer people dying from cold will be outweighed by the people who might die from the heat?
So there's a couple of things we need to pull out of there. The IPCC, the UN Climate Panel, is absolutely right that poor countries are more vulnerable. They suffer a lot more of this. If you actually look at the statistics, both rich and poor countries have seen dramatic declines in the vulnerability to extreme weather. This has nothing to do with climate, but everything to do with the fact that when you get people out of poverty, when you don't live under corrugated roof, you're much more likely to survive a hurricane. So this is basically about, if you want to help people not die in extreme weather, it's mostly about getting them out of poverty. It's not about tackling climate change, because even if what we do dramatically will only have a tiny impact in 50 or 100 years. So that's one part of it. On the cold and heat, it's important to recognize that right now we actually know that there is a trade-off. So as temperatures rise, you're going to see more heat deaths. You're going to see fewer cold deaths because there are many, many more cold deaths and heat deaths on the planet. We're actually seeing a net positive. But in some sense, this is not what's relevant, because these are, if you will, these are already baked into the whole conversation. So yes, it is important to recognize that overall we're actually seeing fewer people die from heat and cold, but that's more sort of a rhetorical point than anything that will guide our politics. We still need to make sure that we see fewer people die from heat in the long run. One of the ways we do that, we know that very, very well. That's what they did in France after 2003, when we had that huge heat wave in Europe and killed a lot of especially elderly French people in Paris, was to get air conditioning in old people's home. That's not rocket science. That's how you do it. But of course, in the long run, we also need to tackle climate change. But again, you're not going to do that by telling people, I'm sorry, would you be a little colder, a little poorer, a little less comfortable? You can't drive as much, you can't fly as much, all this stuff. That's not going to work. And we're seeing it on populations around Europe. And certainly we're seeing it in the rest of the world. You're going to do that by making sure you get green energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels. That's how you do it. And again, also, if you think about, if you look at what the U.S. did with they got their fracking going. This is George Bush, and it was not because he was concerned about climate change, but it happens to do natural gas, which is much cleaner than coal. It made natural gas much cheaper, and so you saw a dramatic switch away from coal towards gas, and that actually reduced U.S. emissions more than any other country in the world over the last 15 years, because we made greener, not green, but greener energy much cheaper.
There's obviously I don't know if you're aware, there's a big debate going on in the UK right now about Labour have got a £28 billion green plan, which started off at 28 and then it's sort of been whittled down, and some of it actually might be already baked in. And is it 20? And the Conservatives seem to think that this is a real stick to beat them with. They want to do something to deal with climate change. I mean, Labour say, well, actually, it's more of an economic thing, because if we can green the economy, that's good for the economy. We're less reliant on imported energy and that sort of thing. I mean, are you aware of it? Are we wasting our time even having that argument?
I've seen that conversation. I'm by no means an expert. But again, what we have to recognize is climate is going to be a problem, but our climate policies could very easily end up being so costly that people will actually say, no, we're not going to do that. We saw that in Holland. You could argue that Donald Trump is one of those guys that will get elected when people get sick and tired of too many taxes, and you can't fly, you can't do this and that and the other. And that's why I think the only sustainable way we're going to have climate policy is by making sure we make it fairly efficient, that is cheap, but actually functioning not just for rich, well-meaning Brits, but also for the Africans and all the other poor people in this world. And that is about investing in green energy R&D. If we can make the next generation of green energy so cheap that everyone will just want to buy, then we've fixed the problem. We don't need all those cops. And that's the real point. Right now, we all meet up once a year and we all twist each other's arms to promising stuff we actually would prefer not to do. That's not going to work out in the long run. What will work out is if we get the technology right.
This was supposed to be a reason to be cheerful conversation. Just finally, I want to ask you, while we're worrying about R&D for tackling climate change, what about the sort of the looming prospect of World War III? Every year seems to begin with another warning that the world is getting less safe, it's more volatile, whether it's America's place on the world stage, Russia, China, Ukraine, the Middle East. Is that a bigger worry?
Yeah, I'm a statistician. I don't have good arguments, and I certainly don't have a good crystal ball to tell you whether this is happening. And I think there is some real concern here. But one of the things you also need to remember is, if you look back in time, many more people died from war. So we are living in an incredibly safe period of time. So right now, about 3 people out of 100,000, of a million, die from wars. That's what's been happening for the last a couple of decades. In the 20th century, it was 30 on average. So we've seen a tenfold decline. We've virtually no wars. Yes, there is a war in Ukraine, and there's a couple other ones, and it's terrible where people are dying. But most of us are not dying exactly because we live in an incredibly peaceful world. We forget that because we every day hear the news about this war and that war. But one of the things that struck me as very, very absurd over the last 10 years is virtually nobody heard about the enormous and very sustained war in the Congo. Yeah, that we had a war certainly for 10 years that probably killed more than 1 million people. Nobody heard about it because it was not sexy. So again, we hear some wars. There are lots of other wars we don't hear about, and we need to get a sense of proportion. Now, the real concern is, again, nuclear weapons. That's something I can't tell you about. But fundamentally, we live in one of the most peaceful times in the world. It's less peaceful since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it's not the most peaceful time, but it's much, much better than pretty much anything else you see in the 20th century and before.
And it goes back to that 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes. It's not a smooth conveyor belt. Well, it's been fascinating to speak to you. It's always good to get a slightly more upbeat assessment of where we are. Bjørn Lomborg, thanks so much for joining us on Times Radio. The book, Best Things First, is out right now. Bjørn, lovely to speak to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.